Welcome. This is David Boles, Human Meme. Today's topic, After the Flood, Hacking the Human Meme Podcast. Well, it's been a while, and today we're going to take a behind-the-scenes look at how this Human Meme Podcast is created and produced. It takes about 3 hours to write, record, edit, and publish a single 10-minute episode. And I warn you now, the script for this exact podcast was written the day I planned to record it several weeks ago. And then a flood hit. And several more weeks have passed since the final draft became yet another draft. Here's what happened. A heat pipe burst on the third floor of this building and flooded us out on the first floor studio, and everything was lost, soaked, gone, and waterlogged. And so, this Human Meme Podcast information I'm about to share is rightly good for about episodes 10 through 140 or so. And then the technical specs of this Human Meme Podcast will change. Change to reflect our ongoing difficult resolution in dealing with the loss of equipment and studio time and the immeasurable loss of equity in the production of this podcast. When this Human Meme Podcast started, some 140-odd episodes ago, I recorded the first 3 on my iPhone, just to test the theory if what I was trying to do would work or not. Back then, in the early days, last July or so, it's currently February, I worked off a rough outline and I would contemporaneously speak my mind. Then I decided to go a little more professional and formal. And I upgraded to a USB mic for my MacBook Pro. And I recorded the podcast using Audio Hijack and edited with Fission. We initially published this podcast on SoundCloud, but then quickly retreated and reconsidered and moved over to Libsyn. The upgrades sounded better, but just okay. And me being raised on radio, I knew the sound I was chasing was out there and it was going to cost me more time and more money to get us there. So I upped the commitment, dedication, and the ante, and purchased the following hardware to help me get that sound I heard in my head, but had yet to hear in the production of this podcast. And so, for those episodes 10 through 140, I used a 2015 MacBook Pro, a 15-inch, to record the podcast. Yes, I got some fan noise from the machine, but I was able to adaptively remove the fan hiss post-production. I also used a Neumann 105 microphone. Now, some have corrected me and said it's actually pronounced Neumann. And while that Neumann mic gave me pretty much the right sound, it did tend to pick up wild noises in front of me and behind the mic, and so we have fan noise and natural room noise recorded raw. And since I would read my podcast script from my computer screen, sometimes, if you carefully listened as I raised my voice, you could get a glimmer of bounce and echo from my voice as it reflected from my computer screen and then hit back into the backside of my Neumann mic, my Neumann mic. I discovered, through trial and error, that sometimes whispering was often the better and safer effect. Also, in the production of the Human Meme podcast, I used a Samson PS01 plosives filter for all of my popping Ps. And I've always used Mogami Gold cables for my guitars, and getting the XLR versions for the podcast microphones set up worked perfectly. And it worked both then and it works now for all of my broadcasting setup. Since the Neumann mic, the Neumann microphone, needed 48 volts of phantom power to operate, I used the USB Pre-2 sound input mixer. And I was using that mixer as my daily sound processor as well. And it was an audio card. Terrific stuff. Expensive, but you could hear the difference. Since I've been an Adobe Creative Cloud client since the beginning, mainly for Photoshop and Dreamweaver, I use those every day. Setting up the bundled Adobe Audition as my sound recorder and editor was a natural choice, and it does not disappoint. Simple to use and easier to set up. I then listened to, monitored everything via the Audio Technica ATH-M50X headphones. Best wired headset I've ever used. And I've been in radio since I was 13 years old. Those cans are crisp, clear, true, and loud. When I would record out in the field, I used the Tascam DR100 MK3. New this year, a lot of power for a simple task. But it got the job done right. I would record the podcast as a WAV file for highest fidelity, and then export it upon publication as an MP3 file. And that file would be uploaded to Libsyn for distribution. I would save all my raw files locally to my Google Drive, an external drive, and also to Dropbox, just to be safe. Paranoia is the best backup method. I also know some of my podcast broadcasting partners like Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play Music, and maybe even iHeartRadio all store a local copy of my podcast episodes on their server. And that's actually comforting to know that I have those files stored remotely in the wind and the wild for download and preservation later, just in case something horrible happens, like a flood, and you lose everything around you. Okay, so all of that was the past. So here's the tech specs update of this Human Meme podcast after the flood. I now use a Shure SM7B microphone. I use a cloud lifter to boost the SM7B to a usable level. I now directly record on an SDXC memory card right into the Tascam DR100 MK3. Headphones are now Bluetooth Beoplay H9. My everyday speaker for audio monitoring is a Bluetooth Beolit 15. I still edit, but this time on a new MacBook Pro 13-inch with the Touch Bar. And Adobe Audition is still the editor of choice. So yes, I pared down the tech chain in the production of this podcast to try to keep things simpler and purer and safer and faster and viable. And if we flood again, or have a fire, or some other ungodly thing, the losses will be nominal, replaceable, and easier to recover from in the long view. I originally published this Human Meme podcast 5 days a week. Right now, we're about once a week until I can get my electronic mojo back, and we may publish more regularly soon, so please stay tuned. And I remember the good old days of just a few weeks ago when I averaged between 10 to 15 pre-recorded episodes in the Human Meme publishing queue ready to fire. Quality matters more than quantity. We now have a solid library of published episodes, and that counts a lot. You may not know that the average life of a podcast, any podcast ever, overall industry average is 24 episodes. Yes, 24 episodes, and most podcasters are finished. They cannot go on. And so, my friend, this Human Meme podcast is more than 7 times beyond that average plateau. And we're not done yet. Here's some more insight into the publication process. I write tomorrow's recorded podcast today. It takes me about 2 hours and an average of 6 typed pages. I now script 90% of the podcast, just because it's faster for preparation and because it is easier to notate a script in editing than it is figuring out where and why I went wild and going off on a tangent. But we still reserve the right to go off on a wild tangent. I now prefer to record this podcast first thing in the morning, like 5, 6, 7 a.m., before the rest of the building wakes up for the day. Because the biggest impediment I have every day that imperils this Human Meme podcast is external sounds I cannot control and noise I cannot edit out of the podcast. And as I am speaking to you right now, there is a low hum that has just started somewhere in the building. Do I stop? Do I wait? Do I continue? Does this new microphone and recording setup even record it? The old setup, you'd hear the hum. The new setup, we'll find out in editing. And that's an interesting problem. When you spend good money on good recording equipment, it has a habit of doing its job really well and picking up and finding sound. And you have then set yourself into a permanent conundrum. Do I record now when it's sort of quiet? Or later when it might be noisier or quieter? And the solid answer is there is no good solid answer. An active building in a big city is going to be loud and noisy, and you cannot ask your neighbors to be quiet in order for you to record your podcast. So I generally find the early morning hours are okay for finding quiet pockets of time to record. But recording a podcast takes patience. You're prepared and ready to go, and then the random sounds begin. Heat moving in the pipes. Car radios outside. A 60-cycle hum. Random music. Fire alarms with expired batteries. Electrical interference. The bathroom fan humming 3 floors above you. And get this, even the shirt I wear can sometimes be uncooperative. I have discovered in the course of this Human Meme podcast that some shirts are crinklier than others. And when I get going and I am moving my arms and body and flaying around and some fabric resonates, you can hear the cloth moving on my arm. Annoying. Nude podcasting must be a thing somewhere. And now I understand why. And so, in the course of the human events of this Human Meme podcast, you sit and you wait for the wrong sounds to pass or to pause, and you speak between the ruckuses. And so, my friend, that's how a modern-day, non-professional studio podcast gets recorded today, in between the blips and the blurps. It takes me about an hour a day to record and then edit the podcast. I say it takes about 30 minutes of record time to get a 10-minute finished podcast. And most of that recording time is spent waiting for a random sound to pass. Then I have to listen to what I recorded and edit out all the bad bits, mistakes, sounds, plosives, hums, uncomfortable breathing, and so on. And that's a bit of a major task to get the sound right. And since I am chasing a specific sound, I want it right. I'd rather take an extra half hour to defeat that background noise than to just let it go as part of the natural environment. And we'll see how long I can keep that up, because a bigger city and noisier buildings are always just a whisper away. And so once I have the right sound in head and hand, and this Human Meme podcast has been edited and structured as best as possible, I listen to the MP3 file via iTunes to make sure it sounds right natively. Then I upload it to Libsyn. I set a release date and associate promotional material to the episode, and usually release at 10 a.m. on a weekday. Libsyn then syndicates this Human Meme podcast to the following places, all of them auto-magically and without any interference from me. And that is an example of ubiquity in being. Unlike blogging, a podcast has many first homes. Boles.com, bolesbooks.com, and scriptprofessor.com all have Human Meme podcast autoplayers. Just visit those websites, read, look around, and listen. In the sidebar of my WordPress.com hosted bolesblogs.com blog, you will find a link to the Human Meme podcasts. But there is no native audio player available. WordPress.com will not allow Libsyn access in audio shortcodes or in plugin support. Sad. And so I also set up a Blogger blog, brand new for this podcast, because my WordPress.com blog will not play my podcast natively. And so humanmeme.blogspot.com looks and feels and operates perfectly and beautifully if you just want to listen. I also invite you to visit humanmeme.com. That page is hosted and created by Libsyn. And while I have some control over the content, I don't really have much control over the look and the feel of the aesthetic of the page. Libsyn also updates my Twitter accounts, @DavidBoles and @BolesBlogs, with new episodes. On my Boles Facebook page and on my personal page, you get the Human Meme podcast as an audio video file. You get episodes of this podcast that natively play in Facebook. It's nice. I don't have to link outside in order for Facebook people to natively listen. This Human Meme podcast also appears on YouTube as an audio to video file, just like on Facebook. Boles Blues is my username on YouTube. Subscribe and be surprised. iHeartRadio does a great job now with podcasts. It actually streams them just like a radio station. It's totally boss radio at its new best. On iHeartRadio.com, you can endlessly play all Human Meme podcast episodes 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day of the year. You just turn it on and it runs. Human Meme also goes to my LinkedIn page. You can listen and subscribe there too. Boles is my username on that network. Oh, and there's also Tumblr. Is that still around? Still a thing? Yes. Read and listen here. davidboles.tumblr.com. As well, you can catch this podcast on other iTunes RSS distribution channels like TuneIn and Stitcher and Overcast and Google Play and so on. And as you may know, there are no Human Meme episode numbers. You can jump around anywhere and not be left behind. You will always be caught up, no matter where you choose to listen first. Now you may be able to hear behind me water running as someone above me is taking a shower somewhere in the building. Yes, it's an odd sensation to build your podcast around the personal grooming habits of your neighbors. Each Human Meme podcast episode has one idea, one thought that we cover in 10 minutes. One shot. We don't have any diagrams, score sheets with times of what happens or appears when during the show. Just listen, and then you're done. And always remember, a human meme is a way of knowing. We explore the mimetic of how we arrive at learning things from each other. We are, together, the ultimate deification of meming. Thank you for listening. Be a human meme.